Welcome to OPSEC Dev, where we discuss DevOps tooling and practices that I've come across and I personally use along with my customers and engagements. It's something which I'm passionate about. Hope to cover more of these tools and more of these technologies as I come across them, as I use them. Right now, I am very passionate about AWS Cloud Control provider, which allows you to handle or manage the lifecycle of AWS resources using their underlying AWS Cloud Control API. The provider being fully generated from that resources in the CloudFormation registry makes it easier for the contributors and HashiCorp to continue to provide customers, users with the latest AWS innovation at a very rapid pace. With that said, I know most of you might already be using the AWS standard provider or the current AWS provider to deploy workloads into AWS. If that's the case, one of the questions that they usually ask is, what are the things I should consider or keep in mind while I'm using the AWS provider and the Cloud Control provider? Is there a way for me to use them both? And the answer is yes, you can. They're both based on the Terraform provider framework. As with any provider that you can use together, the AWS standard and AWS Cloud Control provider can be used. There are a couple of things I want to bring up to your attention so that it becomes easier for you to adopt it. And one of the modules that I've come across which makes your life easier as you work with both AWS and AWSCC provider. In this case, I'm taking an example of an X-ray sampling rule, which is a resource which can be created with both AWS and AWSCC. You pick whichever provider you want to use. Both AWS and AWSCC provider is able to provision that resource based on the inputs you already have. They have some subtle differences and I want to call that out. Let me pull up my Visual Studio Code. What I have in my Visual Studio Code is an example of an X-ray sampling rule, which are some of the inputs that are in the documentation itself. In this case, the simplest one being a rule name with priority and some asterisks or default values for URL path, host HTTP method, and things like that. See that I've created a tag which has a key of modified by and a value called menu. Let's test the Terraform workload with this to make sure that the resource gets deployed. As with any resource deployment, you want to initialize Terraform so that we can pull down the modules and the providers defined. So in my versions.tf file, I have both AWSCC and AWS specified without any versions. I would expect the Terraform init script to pull up the latest version of both these providers. As expected, one of them is pulling down 5.5.9 and the other is 1.6. While it does that, let me go to the AWS resource and talk about some of the input types. You have string type, you have numbers, you have some attribute types in the tags and the attributes value. Again, the name being specified as attributes itself. I believe the initialization is complete. Let me do an apply. I'm going to use the auto approve switch so I don't have to provide a yes or an input again. And I would expect this to be completed in a few seconds. As with any Terraform flow, you would get to see that pretty screen which says what resource is going to be created. In this case, we are creating the AWS X-ray sampling rule. Seems like that it's created already. If I go to the Terraform state, I should be able to see that resource being managed under my resource list. Now, I said I want to look at creating the same resource using AWSCC. Let me pull up an example that I've already created for and let me talk through how this differs. Let me pull this side by side so it's easier to review. Okay. So what I have on the left-hand side is the AWS provider-based resource, and the other one is the AWS CC-based one. A couple of differences here to start with, the way the inputs are provided. So this input definition is primarily dependent on how the CloudFormation schema is specified. So for AWS CC based X-ray sampling rule, it is defined as an attribute that comes under an object called sampling rule, or an attribute called sampling rule. So you have your rule name, fixed rate, priority, and all those definitions which you already saw in the other one, also provided in this case, but inside the sampling rule attribute. Think of it as a JSON with a few bits of key and value examples being passed into a variable or an input. Another thing that you would see or notice right away is the difference in the way the tags are specified. In case of the AWS provider, it is the key equals value way of handling it, or it's basically, think of it as an attribute or a JSON that is provided into the tags value. In case of AWS CC provider, you say that it's an attribute list, where it's an array of key value pairs that can be associated with the resource. So ignore the values. I've just set them separately. These are examples from the documentation directly. Otherwise, you'd see the structure is similar. Give an example. I've named the rule name as slightly different so that AWS CLI or AWS API doesn't throw an error that the resource already exists. Let me read on the Terraform apply auto approve stage again. I would expect the AWS Cloud Control provider based resource to pick up. And it is. And it should be created in a few seconds. And that is created. Let's go to the stage to see if it's actually pulled up. Now, if I look at the first resource, that is still the AWS sampling rule resource. The second one, we have an AWS CC based sampling rule. So we have the ability to create both these resources. They do the same thing. In this case, all I'm doing is creating them using two different providers, both deploying workloads into AWS. Now, we talked about this in the first video itself. So what's so different in here? One of the first things I noticed when I was working with these resources is the question around how I'd manage the tags that I need to provide into the resources which are either deployed by AWS and AWS CC provider. Now, I want that consistent experience from my side or a user so that they only have to provide it in one way, and the other one should be inferred in some way and managed and deployed. Now, that's where one of the AWS infrastructure automation team's module comes in handy. It's called label. And the structure or definition goes like this. Here, the module, I've named it as tags shared. The source is AWS IA label AWS. And you can pull up whatever version it needs. This is going to pull up the latest version. And I'm going to use what I have in here is the tags that I've created. In this case, I'm going to say modified by. And I'm going to say it's called menu. So this should still be, I'm going to provide the same way as an AWS input. So this should be familiar with anyone who's using it currently. I'm not going to use it yet. I'm just going to initialize the module and see what happens. As with any module or any new provider, you need to initialize. So I'm going to initialize this module so that it gets pulled down. So you can see the version 0.0.6 of tags shared or AWS IA label has been pulled down. Now, one of the things I want to highlight here is the way you can use this module across the resources. Now, if I make a Terraform, so that TFY in this case stands for Terraform apply auto approve in my case, you see there are no changes because you've not made any changes. So with the Terraform apply, there are no changes to the infrastructure, so that means no changes to the configuration, which is what we expect because we did not associate anything. We did not change anything with respect to these resources, even though built on another module. So one of the ways you can provide is using the outputs that are provided by this module. So in case of AWS provider or AWS CC provider, you can use module dot, in this case, tag shared dot tags. What this will do is it'll convert the existing tags that are provided to this module and into a consistent format that is required by the AWS CC provider. So obviously the next question is, how do I specify that for my AWS provider? It is similar. You have another example in here. You have another output in here. The only difference is it is called tags underscore AWS. If I go back, and I'm going to run the Terraform apply again with auto approve, and let's see how it behaves. No module call. Oh, okay. I had an exam. I have a difference in here. It's called tags underscore shared, which is fine. Terraform apply auto approve. Now I see there are no changes in here. And let's see if I change this value and how it behaves. I've changed the value in the module. Now I'm going to run the auto approve on the Terraform apply again. You can see the value is changed on both the resources. This is the way AWS provider expects it, and this is the way the AWS CC provider expects it. So if you're using both the AWS and AWS CC provider, I think the AWS IA based label module will come in handy for sure. So this is a simple example of how you can use both the AWS or the AWS CC provider to deploy the same resource and use the label module from AWS IA team and provide tags in a consistent manner across the resources and have them be modified to how the provider or the resource in the provider expects it to be. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe. I try to create more content based on AWS CC, which I'm contributing to and which I'm using in my day-to-day life. And if there are some nuances that I've seen which is different from the standard AWS provider that you need to be aware of, I'll make sure of creating another video. If you found this useful, please let me know in the comments if there is anything else that you want me to cover. Thank you, and hope you have a wonderful day.